back home.
Amit Desgupta, you're the Indian consul in Sydney. I'm just wondering how you feel about the way this is being portrayed in India. I mean, do you believe that all the attacks are racially motivated, or do you believe it's more complicated than that?
Well, I think in the Indian media, many of the attacks which have taken place over here, and there is within Australian society a big debate going on at present as to whether indeed Australians and Australian society is racist. I think it's a strong debate, and I think it's a legitimate and credible debate. At the same time, as you said, many of the attackers have been young kids, juveniles, 15 years, 16-year-olds. And many people in Australian society are also asking themselves the question, have we failed our kids? And I think these two questions are critical and important, and it's good that there is a debate about this.
Ravi Bhatia, you're a senior businessman and an established member of the Indian community in Melbourne. What do you make of the way this is being portrayed and of what's actually happening at the moment?
Well, look, in the attacks in the past, there has been a strong element of racism. That's very clear. And there have also been attacks of opportunity, pure criminal attacks. For example, some of the people involved, some of the attackers involved are very young. They are in their teens, mid-teens. And they would probably not even be punished. They will probably be let go as juveniles.
But I'm interested in the bigger picture here at this point, because this has done considerable damage to this portrayal has done considerable damage to Australia's image in India, and also the incidents clearly have done that damage as well. I'm not suggesting that that's not the root cause of a lot of that. But what I'm interested in is the fact that it has taken off as representing racism, that these attacks are racially motivated. Now, do you believe they are, or do you believe they aren't?
Some of them clearly are racists. And, for example, Saurav's beating in the train compartment, there is no other reason for it, for him to be, beaten up. In Manish's case, it looked very clearly to be racist because they were not even robbed. So there are clearly some racist attacks. And there are clearly some attacks which are crimes of opportunity.
This difference between these two things, I mean, Trevor Carter, how do the police decide what's racist and what's opportunistic? Well, and opportunistic means, of course, wrong place, wrong time. It doesn't really matter who you are, you would have been in that position.
It does, and that's the issue, is that these are the people that would prey on these vulnerable people, because that's what they are. They're vulnerable, and not just confined to Indian students. There's a whole range of other people that are subject to these sorts of crimes as well.
And vulnerable because they're travelling late at night?
Because they're travelling late at night and the circumstances that they find themselves in. The point I want to make is that the question about are they racial or are they opportunistic, the work we've done indicates by far and large the crimes that we're seeing in relation to the robberies are just opportunistic crimes.
And Robert, in Sydney?
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same thing. The vast majority of these crimes are opportunistic. The evidence, even in a place like Harris Park, is that the victims are not all Indians or students of at all. The evidence is that the assailants are not all from one background. Most of these crimes are opportunistic.
Navjot, you were involved in the Indian protests, student protests in Harris Park. What do you think? You were listening with interest there.
Okay, because if somebody is travelling late at night, it's not police's duty to label them as a soft target. Okay, what happened in Harris Park and why it happened? Because Indian students, or let's say for international students, got sick of police tactics. Now, I really appreciate Robert Redfern's concern. It's now proactive step. They're taking proactive step. But why not before? And how long is going to be proactive? Because Indian students at this time, they think that it's just a cover-up for 2 or 3 months, and after that it will be reactive again.
Robert?
Well, I think the evidence just doesn't support what Navjot says. The reality is, I've already said, when this first arose in Harris Park in 2007, I think in the 3 months leading up to June of 2007, there were 18 robberies in Harris Park. In the 3 months leading up to 2009, there were 6. The reality is that's because police have been active in this area for a very long time.
But those student protests in Harris Park were pretty angry, weren't they?
And I think it's interesting that the thing that seemed to have been the spark for Harris Park, there were 2 issues. The first was an incident which involved egg throwing by 2 17-year-old boys who had never been in trouble before, not at the more serious end of the scale, although important. And the second thing is misinformation. One of the things we're trying to do now is work with these communities And I've spoken to these young people again today about having SMS contact with them, for example, because there were all sorts of stories went out about abductions and people being killed, which were not true.
OK. Trevor Carter, what about in Melbourne? I mean, we've seen big protest in Melbourne over this as well. I mean, do you think the police have been dealing with it properly? And what do you mean when you talk about soft targets? Because clearly that's been there's been quite an emotional response from Indian students to that term.
Yeah, there has. Look, as I said before, we've identified this issue back in 2007, where particularly in the western suburbs we saw an increase. And we started to do some work in relation to this particular problem by working with the universities, working with our crime prevention people, getting in there, talking to students, doing a lot of operations in and around the railway stations. So we've been very active in this area for probably the last 18 months to 2 years. And more recently, we've put a reference group together with a whole range of people from the community, from tertiary education providers, from local government, to look at what we can do to actually reduce this problem.
But tell me what you mean by soft targets, just so everyone here is clear on how that term is, what you mean by that term.
Soft target, and we haven't used the word, but it's soft target. It means the people that I suppose their vulnerability puts them in a position where they're easier to attack.
Your commissioner used the term.
Yeah, he did. But I mean, that's really a police term to describe a particular set of circumstances.
And
the issue is about vulnerability, and for a whole range
of... But vulnerability can be because of race. What do you mean by vulnerability?
Well, it can be because of a whole range of reasons.
If you're dealing with racists, it can be because of race.
Yeah, but I don't really think in this situation the issue of vulnerability relates to race. I think it's about the circumstances that a broad range of people find themselves in, which leaves them in a position where sometimes they can be subject to these sorts of crimes.
OK, comment. Yes.
I actually have a problem with the term soft targets because I think it is a term which one can use to almost say that the way you behave becomes a justification for attracting attacks. Today, the international student community is a soft target. Tomorrow it will be the elderly. The day after is going to be the physically or the visually challenged. So I have a real problem with that. But to go back to a question that you actually started off with, which is on the demonstrations at Harris Park, I think the core issue on the Harris Park demonstrations needs to be explored a bit. The students were not just demonstrating against attacks. They were demonstrating actually about a cluster of issues, which included their entire living over here. The fact that the private colleges that they were studying in were not entirely kosher, the difficulties they had with regard to being cheated. I think it's a whole series of things put together which actually gave vent to considerable angst and frustration. And I think that needs to be looked at.
We are going to deal with those issues in just a moment. We're going to talk about how Indian students get to Australia and why some of them are vulnerable once they arrive. That's next on Insight. Tonight we're talking about recent attacks on Indian students, and with attention focused on them, what's emerging is a complicated picture of why some of them are vulnerable. Sarab, we heard earlier about the attack on you. Now, you were on a train to Werribee at night. Yeah. Why? Tell us why.
Because I work in a KFC in Melbourne Central. So, I'm always, finish my work in the evening at 7 o'clock, and I just took a train from Flinders, 8:05 train, and it's a 2 station back to my home, and the few people just get in, and it was 7 to 8 people, and they just sit next to me and they start the same thing and just asking for the money and cigarettes. I said I don't smoke and I don't have money, and I said I've just finished my work, I'm just so tired, so just please guys leave me alone. And they just start the things.
I'd like to talk a bit about your